Hi, my name is Thomas Grip, and I'm one of the co-founders of Frictional Games. I worked with engine code, gameplay code, design, and many other things for Amnesia. In my commentaries, I will mainly focus on the design behind the different parts of the game. I hope you'll enjoy them. The name of this level is Rainy Hall, and it's supposed to be a combination of atmosphere setter and tutorial for the player. We wanted the player to start the game in a slow way so they could settle in and get used to how the game works. Amnesia is not a game with constant action happening all the time, and we wanted to have a constrained map where the player gets used to this. The only thing you need to do is to follow the track and get to the end of the level. Also, following tracks is something that becomes very useful in later levels, so we try to teach players this from the start. This is one of the first levels that we created for the game, and it was initially part of the archives level, which we will reach in a bit. Amnesia started out with a pretty different design, and when we redesigned it, the maps did not fit. This caused us to split them up and scatter them out. So in the first design, after this corridor, the archives level was supposed to follow, and the room lying there now was built much later. In fact, the first designs did not have Daniel waking up with an amnesia at all, and it was actually added later on. In the first story draft, Daniel still had hidden memories, but he was unaware of this at the start of the story. However, as we redesigned things, we found a waking up with amnesia thingy, although a bit cliché, much more fitting. This is one of the many hub levels in the game, and this is a design concept that we started out with in Penumbra. The idea is to give the player some freedom on where to go, but at the same time give a clear objective. In this level, the slime obstacle is a thing that the player needs to get past, and all other levels then have things needed to do so. The slime itself is one of the few puzzles left from the initial designs, and the one I'm probably the least proud of. Now that slime appears all around, it feels a bit forced that you need to have a potion on the slime. Many testers also complained that they wanted other options in getting rid of the slime, like burning it. However, creating a potion is the central theme for this hub, so we had to let it be. I don't think it's that bad, but we probably could have redesigned it if we had time. This level was changed a lot, and I think it's one of the most tweaked levels that we got. Not only was it part of the big archives level that we had to split up, but it was also hard to get it engaging enough. The problem here is that we don't have any sort of fun mechanic that we rely on to make the game engaging. Instead, we rely on story, atmosphere, and environment. This is true for many other levels and the game as a whole, but these were kind of the one of the larger levels that we made, and also one that didn't have much puzzles and such. So when testing it, we quickly get bored with it, and we wanted to add more spooky events to spice it up. But then later on, testing proved that these events weren't that necessary, and we also felt that they were a bit lame and not fitting, so we decided to remove them. Then the back part of the level, we wanted to make that a more linear experience, with the current player getting trapped and all, forcing the player to solve the destroy wall and find secret door puzzles. Previously, testers often missed that they can solve these problems. The level is now very different from the early designs. In early concepts, this was meant to be a sort of wine testing room and directly connected to the wine cellar. The reason for the whole wine testing thingy was that we planned on having more laboratories in later levels, so a lab here as well felt kind of strange. Then things changed and only one lab was left in the design, so we changed the name to laboratory instead. The whole wine testing facility that could make dangerous acid always felt kind of strange anyways. A major design guideline for us was to give each level a unique theme. Something that all puzzles, events, and the general atmosphere was built upon. This makes each level a little piece of the story and theme at large, and also gives them focus so the player is not distracted with too much information. The theme in this level is the strange creatures that lurk in the castle. The player first spots them momentarily in archives, so now is the perfect place to build some fear. There is never any real threat in this level, but it's much darker than any before, and there's a constant pressure with boards creaking and the like. The flashbacks also give hints of where strange creatures come from, making all events focused on the level's central theme. This level was first called Distillery, and if you check the data file, it's still named as such. Now, for some reason, I told Mikke, our writer, that it was called Refinery, and the voiceover was recorded with the wrong name. Since it's easier to change a name than a piece of voice data, we had to rename it. I'm glad I said Refinery though, and not King's Hall or Grandma's Vegetable Patch. That would not have been as fitting. At first, the creature in the water, affectionately called Lurky here at Frictional Games, did not have a sense of sound. Later on we wanted to add it though, so the player could lure it away by throwing stuff in the water. When I added this, something unexpected happened. Lurky started following me. When you jump on the crates, it hears the sound you make when you land and it goes there to investigate. This was very fun emergent behavior, and I think it made him even more menacing. I also want to add that Lurker was kind of inspired by my favorite movie as a child, The Tremors. I guess this early obsession might also explain some creatures in our older games. This level is the high point of the Lurker build-up, which sort of started in an entrance level with the slime appearing. It's supposed to be a sort of roller coaster ride and is designed to be easy enough to be completed on the first try. Yet, it should also be stressful. Many of the things in a level that seems like you barely make it are just scripted to be that way. But it's nothing you notice because they're blended in with the truly deadly stuff. This is the second hub level of the game and is supposed to give some contrast to the stressful Lurker encounter. We think building up contrast like this is extremely important for the horror mood. Only by seeing a bright level can you appreciate the dark one and so on. If you do not do this, player will get used to the stuff and the effect will lessen greatly. In this room, everything is connected to destruction and home. This was Daniel's home as Alexander's guest, and the diary entries are about Daniel being home in London and things falling apart. These sort of connections are not something that we want the player to get, but rather it should end up in the subconscious and work toward building the mood. Also worth noting is this focus, as explained in the commentary of Winecellar, where we want the player's attention on a certain aspect. We hope this makes the story clearer. The idea is to slowly build it up, one part at a time, giving the player time to digest and think about it. The decision to have the player go outside in this map started out as a quick and dirty idea for some sort of puzzle. However, it turned out very nicely, and to see the trees really gives a feeling of being in a castle and not just on some set. The first idea was not even to have the player break the window and just have it open directly instead. But when we added it, we felt it gave a really nice feel and reward for finishing the puzzle. In retrospect, we should have had more moments when the player ventures outside, and it gives this feel of being a part of a larger world. Again, there's a lot of elements here working together. Not only does the player enter the darkest level yet, they'll also come up against a dark part of Daniel's memories. We've tried to have all aspects of the level work towards this goal. Hopefully it creates an oppressive and disturbing feel to it. This is another one of those contrast levels, this time calming the player down for what will happen once the elevator is finally running. The map is still dark though, giving a bit of foreboding for what is about to happen. This elevator ride is actually constructed like one at a Swedish theme park. It's not the elevator that moves, but the wall. I assume movies use the same trick a lot. Previously in the game, it has been all about events in the past, but with these prison levels we wanted to bring it to the present, and many events experienced are happening here and now. An example of this is a prisoner being dragged off at the start of the level. Here also starts the most encounter-intense part of the game, and we were a bit unsure on how much enemies we could add. We added what we thought was enough, but after some testing and feedback, we decided to add even more. The amount of encounters experienced depends a bit on how you play the level, but hopefully you should feel constantly oppressed. Since this was the last level that this enemy has a greater part in, we did not fear overusing it either, so I think the amount of enemies here is pretty nice. After the prison level, some light is needed, and that is what we want to give the player right now. We also wanted to have an environment that did not look like anything else the player has seen so far. When the player has endured the dark and gloomy dungeon levels, we wanted to give some sort of award for coming so far, and this level is supposed to be that award. The sound of water is also found quite soothing for most people, so we wanted them to relax, calm down. Only to be more acceptable for scares later on, of course. This map is all about themes, and the action the player does are meant to reflect what happens in the diary entries. The player needs to turn the valves in order to progress, but at the same time, things go bad every time this is done. The level gets darker, the sound of someone being trapped gets louder, and the water lurker seems to be coming closer. Everything tells the player not to turn the valves, yet it must be done. Something that reflects how Daniel feels in the diaries. The flashback of the guy trapped is actually inspired by true events. During the bubonic plague outbreaks, people were buried so quickly that it was not always checked that they were probably dead. This meant that people sometimes woke up, finding themselves locked up, entombed, surrounded by corpses. Scratches on doors and walls of such rooms have been found, confirming that it did happen. As with the cistern, this takes the player closer to Daniel's dark past. It was important here that the corpses did not have the normal gory shock value, but was more true to reality and disturbing. We really wanted to approach this stuff with respect and not just show it in an exploitative fashion. I hope that shows when you play the game. The Agrippa Awaken sequence is inspired by the movie Seven, when they find the sloth victim. I thought that scene was really disturbing, so it stuck to me. When writing the design of the Agrippa event, it came to mind instantly. A fun thing about Agrippa is that it was first supposed to be a severed head that was placed at several locations in the game. It then later turned into the guy that is in the game now. If you wonder why he does not have a lower jaw, then that's because we did not have the resources for voice sync. It was then worked into the story though, as Alexander does not want him talking when he shouldn't. The staircase is inspired by The Haunting, the black and white version. I really love spiral staircases, and I find there's something ominous about them. Also worth noting is that the torture devices in the level are all real, and that things similar to those depicted had happened in real life. Even in present days. For example, strappado is still a common torture method. As discussed in another commentary spot, we tried to take the sub seriously and stay away from just divulging in gore and stuff. It's kind of fun, or perhaps I should say disturbing, that the methods Alexander describes in the note could almost be used to describe how we do horror. I will let you draw your own conclusions from that. The inspiration for this level came from the first Silent Hill game, when you run around in the town. I wanted to recreate the feeling of being lost, knowing that dangerous creatures lurked in the fog. I did not really like the map in the Silent Hill games though, as you always had to switch back and forth between it. So in all our games we tried to come up with other ways to help the player navigate. In this level it meant that you should follow the pipes. This was not really apparent to all people though, and that's why there's a little event at the start. The player feedback from Penumbra Overture's chase scenes were that all who completed them on the first try liked them, and those who did not disliked them. So in order to make the upcoming chase scene engaging, the idea was to make it different every time you failed, instead of forcing the player to repeat the same thing over and over. So if you have failed it once, we do our best to make you believe that now is the time when the chase will begin. This is true for other parts of the game too, but I think it's most apparent in this section. This hopefully means that however you play the sequence, it ends up being thrilling and not annoying.
Hi there, my name is Luis Rodero. I'm mostly the tool programmer, level scripter at times, and perhaps the main reason why the rest of the core team at Fictional Games is pretty much forced to speak English at our internal meeting, as I am the only non-Swede here. Now, what a Spaniard is doing with a bunch of Swedish guys is a whole different story with what we're discussing today. By the way, I will be talking mostly about tools and scripting, hope you like. The editors themselves went through a lot of design changes during the development. Not that many in visual appeal as in internal stuff, like data structures and handling. This happened mostly because at the beginning we only knew the basic stuff that needed to be in them, and as they grew in features and functionality, they started to kind of fall apart, mostly due to my big lack of previous experience in projects like this. Right now, aloud, what the hell still sounds in my head when I look at some parts of the code, but I am still proud of them. They can also get a bit buggy at times, but hopefully this won't happen again in the future, and I already got some nice ideas for the next iteration of the tools. If you haven't followed our development blog back when it started, you might have missed one of the biggest changes in our production pipeline. 2 years back, we started a toolset side project to ease and speed up the creation of content for the game. I'd say the level editor, which is what we, or more specifically Jens, Mark and Marcus, have used to build all the halls and corridors you are working through right now, is the big start of the pack. Its workings in a nutshell, while all the models and assets are actually made in software like Maya or Blender, everything geometry-wise in the levels is put together in it. Then lighting and sweet details like decals and fog are added in. While this approach might sound simple, really nice stuff can come out from it, as you can see in the game. Scattered throughout the game, you can see some signs written in Latin. The reason for using it is that it was considered a language of culture and science, as most scientific and philosophy authors wrote their works and treatises in it. As we are dealing with a castle dwelled by a pretty smart guy that has been around since the Renaissance period, Latin all around the place was something we should expect. Being the only guy in the team that had a direct contact with Latin, in high school to be more precise, well, it was kind of logical that any translation to be done would have my name on it. Translating stuff into Latin was kind of a strange and fun task to do. At first I had a classic Latin dictionary, so if I had to translate any modern term, I would have to track its etymology down to the Latin equivalent, or look for a synonym or similar expression that had a direct translation. Then I had the luck to come across some dictionary for modern stuff online that addressed most of this stuff for a huge lot of terms, so it couldn't have come in a better time. Some days I would have Sebastian dropping a list of 9 or so entries to be translated, and before finding this dictionary, it was quite a lot of work. On a side note, we even had a choose your Latin poll on a couple entries, just to pick the one that sounded better for everyone. Results were pretty unanimous, by the way. For some final words on this, I must confess that, while I was pretty good at this in high school, that was like 15 years ago, so right now I'm not 100% sure translations are correct at all, but I took the time to make them at least plausible, so my apologies go in advance to any Latin guru up there playing the game, as I myself get on the verge of losing my temper when I see stuff like this obviously made up. To finish this little overview of our tools, I must mention the Material Editor, available both standalone and built into the other editors. The program itself is very simple to use. You have some material types defined by the engine, and you can throw in textures to be used for diffuse, normal maps, height maps, as well as some variables to control specific parameters for a material type. When I was writing it, I could just stare while the preview model rotated around itself and the parallax mapping effect was on when testing, just for fun. The particle editor is also a fine part of the tool bundle, and it is what we use to create particle effects for maps and events. We use particles to do nice effects like the flames in torches and the smoke that comes out from them. All we have to do is add one or more particle emitters, set up some parameters like starting position and speed, on all sorts of fadings in size, color, or speed. It's funny how you can simulate all kinds of effects with such simple elements. I very much recommend you to try it yourself. This pipe you see here can be broken to be used later to join the mill. It is actually a model with two bodies joined by a hinge joint. To do this part of the puzzle, I first made it so you could break the joint at some point when pulling, but this just felt really strange. So I just asked Jens how we were doing this kind of stuff in the game, and he told me to just add some area that counted hits in the script. So every time the pipe collided with this area, a certain variable was increased by 1. If you enable the debug window, you can see this area with activating the draw physics debug option. When this variable reached a given value, it triggers the breakage of the pipe, spawning the broken pipe item, and that's how it works. This is the machinery that controls the mill rotation speed. There is not much to say about this part, just a couple levers that change some values when moved, and do stuff when the right value is set. As you might already know, playing around with the combination of both levers, you can notice a background sound changing. At the time of working on this, there was no proper sound available for these background sounds, so I just picked some placeholders from what was in there already. I thought that creaky sound that is heard when the elevator falls down could do a nice one for the medium speed. How wrong I was. It was unbearable to say the least, so I just ended up removing all placeholders and leaving a to-do note in the script. This here was my first job at scripting a puzzle. I must say that I like working on scripts, but that's probably because I love anything that looks or feels like programming. Scripting puzzles does not involve just writing a plain script. You also get to edit entities, create particle systems, set up stuff like areas and entities in the level to support the script. It is actually a lot of fun, and it allows for quite a bit of creativity. This particular puzzle is about having to jam a can of water mill to be able to get through it. But it first needs to be slowed down somehow. After almost 2 years of continuous development of the editors, this was my very baptism of fire in level creation. My first big level edited ever, that is. Making the base for this level was my assignment for week 8 this year, and I must confess I was pretty excited about it all. You know, not ever having used the editors in a real life run, I was wondering how well I was going to do. A good thing about me using the tools I am dedicated to develop is that I could get a close view on how they feel when working with them. And it's easier and quicker to get bugs fixed when working like this, as they usually get in the middle of the way and the only solution is just getting your hands dirty and fix them. This also works well for small features that don't take much time to add. I'm not sure which one I added from working on this level, but it usually starts like thinking, oh, being able to do this or that will be really nice, and ends up with the feature in the editor. Not everything works like this, you know. I actually have an endless list of stuff to add to the editors, but there is always so little time. They will come eventually, that's for sure, or maybe not. Back on the level editing, it was an interesting experience to say the least. I started with the room with the door leading to level 22 and made my way up from there. I managed to build a reasonable base in a bit over a week's time. It took a bit long, having into account that not all models needed for the level were available at the time I started working on it, and that, blaming my inexperience in level building, I had to remake some parts a lot of times, like the room I started with. It was Marcus who took the level from where I left it, and I must say he did an awesome job. I'm not sure how much of my original work still stands in there, but the final version looks really sweet. I didn't get more level creation assignments after this one, possibly because I am actually more productive in other kinds of tasks, but I am happy I had the chance to try.
Hello, I'm Jens Nilsson, co-founder of Frictional Games. I work mainly with the sound, gameplay and event scripting in Amnesia. For my commentary in this game, I'll jump back and forth between the topics of sound, puzzle creation, and even talk about making this commentary. The basic structure of the earlier levels in the game has been built by me. I have not created the models or anything like that, but I have built the levels with the graphics from the artists using our level editor. This was the very reason for us to create the level editor, as it would allow for the whole team to work on levels, building them from scratch if so needed. For our previous Penumbra games, you could perhaps tweak a level a little bit, but making a whole level was the job for an artist and no one else. In the early days of the Amnesia project, the artists had their hands full with making graphics, and so I was the one building the levels. Looking at the levels now, a lot of things have changed and improved, but the base is still there. Showing that the idea to create the level editor was a sound one of the few things, in fact, with the Amnesia project that has not been scrapped, reworked or modified heavily. The end puzzle with the crank and pulley contraption was a tricky puzzle, not to create or on a technical level, but purely on a noticeable level. We added stuff to the puzzle perhaps 4 or 5 times because after each test session, we kept having testers that did not see the piece of wood that you are to break to complete the puzzle. Originally you could only break it, so we added the option to pull it out as well. Then we added a faint light to draw the attention to it, and also tweaked the description of the crank. After that we added so that when you pull the crank there is a bit of dust falling from the piece of wood, and we also did a slight change in the angle of the piece of wood and changed the color and the texture, all to make it as notable as possible. So the question is, did you notice the piece of wood? I figured I add a little something about the commentary, why it is in the game and how we did it. As you probably have noticed by now, the quality of the recordings are a bit different. We tried our best, but as we do not have an office, everyone had to care for their own voice recording and make do with the equipment that they have. For me as a sound artist and for Mikko and Tapio, this was not really much of a problem. We all got our sound gear to rely on. But for the rest, they really had to work to make the best out of their chat microphones. They even got a checklist of things to do, such as put a sock on the microphone and what angle towards the microphone to speak at. The reason as to why we did the commentary to begin with was that when we were working on Amnesia, we started taking pre-orders of the game, and we put up a meter on the website saying that if we got 2000 pre-orders, we would add a commentary to the game. I suppose you know the answer to the question if we met that goal or not. This level consists of 3 parts of a puzzle. For each part you complete, you get 1 step closer to getting the machinery running. It does not matter which order you do it in, so you can complete the level as you like. When I scripted this level, I made a basic function for completing a puzzle. Then I added some specific tweaks to each puzzle to make them unique, and then finally a grand version of a complete puzzle function to make it really noticeable when you finish all 3 of them. I got surprised when several testers said that it was not clear as to when they completed the whole level. That on the first puzzle it was really nice, but that on the second and third puzzle they did not really notice that they had accomplished something successfully. As I was about to start working on this, I noticed something really strange. I had, for testing purposes, made it so that when completing the first puzzle, you would get the grand puzzle completion function, which meant that the first puzzle had a big bang of events, while the other 2 would only have the minor small puzzle completion events. It had been like this since I finished the level, so no one had never experienced the actual sequence of events meant to take place. This type of bugs are pretty nice to fix because you only fix your own stupid mistake and then all is done. For the torture levels, it was not all that fun to make the sounds. It has a nerve-wracking feeling to it, and I can't say that it is completely enjoyable to make entertainment out of such horrible contraptions. This part of the game is not for show and fun. Its purpose is to create an instinctive feel of horror and repulsion to what these devices are capable of. In the vision, as Daniel performs the ritual, the muffled sound of the man on the table is my own voice. I do some exclusive appearances throughout the game. In fact, in all Penumbra games I am fairly certain there is a Jens here and there. But nothing prior has been so disturbing to work with as in this vision, when having to tweak the flow and style of the events and at the same time having to hear your own panicking, pleading, muffled voice. Escaping the cell has several solutions. In the very first version, there was only one solution to everything. Then by mistake, we had forgotten to remove the hammer item, so obviously testers tried to use it to break down the wall, complaining loudly to us when it did not work. So we added that possibility, and when doing so, all of a sudden the option was there for the player to have a metal bar item as well. So we also added a second solution on how to obtain the key in the pipe. You can use the metal bar to push it out. The original solution is to get the bucket, fill it with water and pour the water down the pipe. There is also a third option for getting out of the cell. Do you know how to do it? In the original design, the player had to make sure to have all of the ingredients for the Agrippa potion before getting captured earlier in the game, or else it would not be possible to complete the potion in the laboratory. After early testing sessions, it was clear that this was way too harsh, as the player can't really escape the capture scene when he has all the 6 orb pieces. Luckily, this level had areas that all suited to add variations to the puzzles from the original ingredient gathering. Depending on what ingredients the player has when coming here, there will be extra objects and areas to interact with to gather the missing ingredients, allowing you to complete the sawing off Agrippa's head puzzle. Sometimes you just can't get completely satisfied with your work. This level is one of those for me. I tested a lot of different versions for how the electric tunnel should sound and for how the orb should explode. In the end, I think it turned out okay, but it was definitely not how I imagined it to begin with. With the tunnel, I tried to have it a bit mechanical, but also with a wooden type of rotating sound, to connect the machinery to the center of the story. The same with the electric barrier. It is very easy to get into too much of a sci-fi mode with a modern electric humming type of noise, so I did my best to keep it like a simple electric malfunction sound. With the orb explosion at the end, or perhaps the implosion of the orb, it was important to have a sound that would work when standing next to it as well as being far away, because the orb can explode when you wreck the machine for the tunnel. With this in mind, it is a very powerful but very damp and dull sound when the orb breaks. From the beginning, this level was more of a mood level, with not much more to do than to explore it, find a diary and then continue on into the final encounter with Alexander. When I started my polish of the level, I felt that as the second last level of the game, it did not really build things up so well. It was too simple for this late part of the game. So at the start of the level, I've added a chase sequence where the guardian is getting close to you and you have to run in and close the door. It's not a big addition to the level, but it gives that little feeling, I hope, that you are running out of time and that you have to push forward and face Alexander as soon as you can. The main issue with this level was the build-up of the sound and balancing that with the voice of Alexander. I had to make sure that all the sounds and music in the level start out at a really low volume, so that there is a lot of room for them to get louder and for more sounds to play as the time is running short and the portal opens. I also tweaked it so that Alexander's voice is louder at the end than what it is at the beginning, to make sure it is always easy to hear what he has to say. If you listen to the music, you will notice that halfway through the countdown of the portal opening, it changes to a more intense and stressful version. There are also the monoliths rotating in the air that has a deep grinding sound that gets quicker and louder the closer you get to the end.
Hello, I'm Mikko Tarmia, the composer from Amnesia The Dark Descent. You may have heard my music before if you played the Penumbra game series, and I did a couple of tracks for Penumbra Tech Demo too. So this is my fifth project with Frictional Games, and I'm happy to be a part of the team. The Guardian monster has its own musical theme, which you can hear in many situations in the game, even if the Guardian is not physically present. Actually, it's more like a noise sound than a certain melody, and I played it with my bassoon. The theme has many forms, and this one is almost a direct sound coming from the instrument. And this noise, which sounds like screaming, is a highly modified version of it. If you listen to the music tracks more carefully, you may find that characters have their own musical themes, which can usually be heard when you read papers during the game. These themes appear in many variations, so it's not always so easy to recognize them immediately. And in the end of the game, some of these themes will go quite insane. Oh, and that's Daniel's theme, which you can hear in the game's menu screen. Let me play it to you with piano. There are a few music clips which include some choir singing words, and I must tell you that these words doesn't mean anything in any language, or at least I didn't intend them to mean anything. I used a sample library which has its own word building function, so you can have a choir sing words. And I just invented words which sounded cool. So don't bother to think what they are singing, that's a waste of time.
Hello everyone, my name is Mikael, and I'm the writer for Amnesia, The Dark Descent. I think we can all feel the story kick-starting as we finish the letter from Daniel. The game itself is just filled with confusion, and I think we're really doing the player a service keeping it simple in the beginning. Basically try to take your revenge on Alexander, that is the premise of the game. You don't really need to dive any deeper than that, but hoping that the player will care about the story, they have the entire game in front of them to decide if they think killing Alexander is justified or not. When I started writing, I had only outlined the framework for the story and the first few levels in the game design document, so I ended up finalizing a lot of material for the first levels, and then when those were done, we planned out the last 2/3 or so. This had a funny effect since I had to not only cater to the story, but to stay true to the stuff I've written for the first levels. Usually you can go back and forth while writing and change things, but if you have already recorded voices, you really shouldn't because of the costs. So the first text really shaped the rest of the material in an interesting way, and made them matter in a way I hadn't thought about. I really like how this thickens the story elements as I am able to jump back into the material and keep using and reinforcing certain concepts. Agrippa is of course the most extreme effect of this method, which grew from a small reference to becoming one of the most important characters in the game. Daniel is a pretty complicated character to write for, as we didn't want the player to feel that they were losing control by having feelings imposed on them. After the amnesia kicks in, everything which is Daniel is essentially gone. The player is the new Daniel, and he should be able to act the way he pleases, and even reject his own background as he discovers it. That is why everything concerning Daniel is flashbacks. Even the diary entries are read as what is being told is happening right now. That is, it is the old Daniel telling the story, and not the player reading it. At first, the hunted girl sequence was just another scare, but as the story took shape, it just became a great plot point, which was this is when Daniel snapped. He does all these weird and evil things, but he tells himself the ends justify the means. But when he finally kills the girl, he just can't make up excuses anymore, so he goes mad, and as a final attempt of saving himself, he drinks the amnesia potion. Of course, the player won't realize this as he encounters this first sequence, but it becomes clear when he finds the last diary pages explaining the situation, making it all come full circle. Alexander along with Daniel makes up the foundation for the entire story. Together they make the core conflict. There was a lot of background for this character as he is in a sense the villain, so I wanted to do everything that I could to make him likable and have people sympathize with him. It's just the best way to make a bad guy. If we can have the player feel for their opponent, they might start questioning their own actions. Alexander's story is quite interesting in its own right, but in the end it was important to have the story deal with the relationship between Daniel and Alexander. That's why there is so much about the last few weeks and so little about the history of Alexander. Because after all, since we're playing Daniel and he seemed to want to get back at Alexander, we the player want to know how bad it really was and decide for ourselves if we think he should be punished. I told Thomas that I wanted a character that the player could look at, or at least know that someone was talking to him right now, as in no flashbacks, no ghosts or memories, just something solid the player could depend on being real. However, a character is really expensive stuff. You need a voice, a model, textures, animations, behavior. So we finally came up with this idea about a stationary character so we could cut down on animations and behavior. At this time, Agrippa was just a character, a real historical character actually, I had used as the writer for a letter found in the first stages of the game. But we upgraded him and made him a part of the plot. The reason I find him so valuable is that he joined the ranks of Daniel and Alexander, making this so much more complex and intriguing. And of course, it also quite naturally led to the split ending thing. One thing which worried me was that the player would feel trapped within the castle in an artificial way, that is, that they would perhaps realize that they are running around these boxed up levels. A good way to disarm this feeling is by adding exterior levels, so I asked Thomas, could we show the outside somehow? He already had some ideas, but he figured they would have to be cut eventually because of the costs. So I was really happy to see this making it into the game. It just gives you that little reminder of that there is a world out there, which is not only made from references. One of my favorite additions to the game was the loading screens, how they was able to mirror and foreshadow the action of the player. Of course, there might not be that many who actually pay attention to these little snippets of text, but there were some really good stuff in there. There is even one character's life you can influence through the game, which is only mentioned in the loading texts, which is Hazel, Daniel's sister, which will either live or have died when she was young, depending on what the player chooses to do in the game. The actions don't correlate, of course, but it is supposed to show that the way the player acts is a part of Daniel's real inescapable behavior. If the player plays Daniel in a caring way, he will have saved his sister from her death when they were younger, and if the player shows no will to help others, she will have died.
Hello, my name is Mark Nikander. I'm a 3D artist and level creator at Fictional Games. I started out as a helper during Penumbra Overture, and I was finally hired as a full-time artist in the later part of Penumbra Black Plague. The entrance hall was first shown in our first gameplay trailer, and while the layout hasn't changed much, the details certainly have. We build our levels from sets of pieces, in this case, the custom-based set. While the carefully planned set pieces made level building very easy, the levels became very similar and we had to make special pieces to the levels. Now, 1.5 years later, the special pieces make up about half of the pieces in the custom-based set, and we made changes to incorporate these objects into the earlier levels. An example of this can be seen if you compare the hole in the roof now with the one from the first trailer. The new roof was made in the middle of the project when we built level 9 Back Hall. A special version was made to give the roof hole in the entrance hall more depth and detail.